Is science a threat to morality? Yes. Does that mean that science makes people bad? No. When we say that science is a threat to morality, I think what we really mean is whether or not the scientific view of the world allows for the existence of morality. That is, given the commitments of modern natural science as to what exists and how the world is to be accurately described, does ethics or morality have any place in that world? Now, I think that that is the question in the background of this section of Russell's Elements of Ethics, Determinism and Morals. And he is dealing with a specific element of the modern scientific worldview, determinism, and asking a question about whether that element of the scientific worldview, determinism, is really a threat to our notion of ethics. That is, whether or not determinism really rules out ethics in at least one aspect. So I think that's the bigger picture of what's going on in section 4 of the Elements of Ethics. Let's now look at the details, and let's, say beforehand that we know what the outcome is, that Russell is taking a position that determinism, far from being a threat to ethics, is actually an essential part of ethics. Now, that may seem, I don't know, natural or plausible, but we should acknowledge that in the history of moral philosophy, that is not the only position that people have taken. Russell says in the beginning of this section, let's call this part 4, and then there are section numbers, and I'll give you specific page numbers in the annotations that pop up. But in section 24, part 4, Russell says, it has been urged by advocates of free will that its denial involves a denial of merit and demerit, and that with the denial of these, ethics collapses. The most prominent thinker in this regard is Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher of the 18th century, who believed that freedom, the notion of an absolutely free act, the possibility of an absolutely free act on the part of a rational creature like a human being, is absolutely essential to save morality. That is, if there wasn't that absolute freedom, there couldn't be morality. And Russell, in that little quote, says it. There would be no merit and demerit. Why? Well, skip ahead to section 26. Russell says this, but when we come to conduct and the notion of ought, we cannot be sure that determinism makes no difference. For we saw that the objectively right action may be defined as that one which, of all that are possible under the circumstances, will probably on the whole have the best consequences. The action which is objectively right must therefore be in some sense possible. But if determinism is true, there is a sense in which no action is possible except the one actually performed. Hence, if the two senses of possibility are the same, the action actually performed is always objectively right, for it is the only possible action, and therefore there is no other possible action which would have had better results. There is here, I think, a real difficulty. What is the real difficulty? Well, determinism is basically the idea that any event, anything that happens in the universe, was determined by previous events. So that if we knew the whole sequence and the connections between previous events, we could predict future events. In fact, all future events. Now, this may be an old-fashioned notion of science that has been superseded by 20th century, 21st century now physics and theory of science, but it has some merit to it. That is the idea that we can make predictions in science, and we can make predictions in science because we know past events, and we know how those events are connected by natural laws. If that is so, then there is a sense in which every event, because it's caused by previous events, is inevitable. So that would apply, as Russell says, to human actions, just as much as to the purely physical actions of the universe. So if it does, there is a sense in which everything that we do, every action that we perform, is simply the inevitable result of previous events in the universe, so that the only possible action that we could take in any particular situation is the action that is determined by previous events. To illustrate this, section 25, the beginning of section 25, Russell mentions the principle of causality, which seems to be at the heart of determinism. It says the principle of causality, that every event is determined by previous events and can theoretically be predicted when enough previous events are known, appears to apply just as much to human actions as to other events. So what is the threat here? Of course, the threat is to the notion of right conduct. Russell has said that the fundamental concepts, the real elements of ethics are good and bad. That these are the primal concepts that we use to pick out that in the world which we think ought to exist, the good things, and that in the world which we think ought not to exist, the bad things. In Russell's mind, science is not a threat to the existence of good and bad things. We'll save that for next week when we read Wittgenstein. In Russell's mind, the threat is to the notion of conduct, because conduct is distinct from goods and bads. Conduct is either right or wrong, and it's right or wrong depending on whether it produces good or bad effects. So the right conduct in any particular situation is the conduct that produces the best outcomes out of all possible outcomes. But the threat here from determinism is that there's only one possible outcome. That is, that whatever we do is the only possible outcome. And we were determined to do it, and there was no getting around doing it. So in that sense, as he says, what we do, since it's the only possible outcome, can be nothing but right, since there were no other possibilities except that which we actually did. So under that view, the human conduct is no different really from any other event in the universe, purely non-ethical physical event. Something happens, and it happened because previous things happened, and there was no getting around it happening. But human events, we believe, have to be different in some respect, at least insofar as they have ethical aspects, that they are right or wrong. Now, is there room for that in the scientific worldview? He gives an example in part 4. This is in section 27. He says, suppose a man in a fire or a shipwreck becomes so panic-stricken that he never for a moment thinks of the help that is due to other people. We do not, on that account, hold that he does right in only thinking of himself. That is true. That is, imagine somebody who finds himself in a shipwreck or a burning building and thinks only of saving themselves and doesn't warn anybody else or do anything with regard to anyone else's welfare. There is no doubt that we would, on the face of it, condemn that action. We would say that that person had done wrong. But there is a sense, again, just as an example, here's just an exemplification of it. If we believe in determinism, there's a sense in which that there is no other possibility. That is, that the person's running out of the burning building or going right to the lifeboat without warning anybody else was determined by previous events. And that, in a sense, I guess we'd say the person couldn't help it. That it was the only possible course of action for that person. And that strikes us as being wrong, at least from the ethical point of view. But from the scientific point of view, or from the point of view that says that determinism is the correct way to view the universe, and certainly Russell is saying that it is the correct way to view the universe, how the universe works, there's a sense in which he couldn't have done anything else. So what Russell is interested here is denying that these two things are incompatible, that there must be some way of looking at the matter which both preserves determinism and preserves the notion of right and wrong conduct and assigning praise and blame to different actions that we engage in. So let's look in the next little talk about his reasons for thinking that these two things, determinism on the one hand, and the evaluation of conduct into right and wrong on the other, are in fact compatible, that they play well together, despite whatever may appear on the surface.